In the final, chaotic months of World War II, the Pacific skies were painted with smoke, fear, and fire. The world had seen endless destruction, kamikaze attacks, burning ships, and skies filled with dogfights between desperate men. Yet, hidden beneath the chaos was one story, a story that defied hatred. It was a moment when a Japanese pilot, trained to die for the emperor, made a choice that went against everything he had been taught. Instead of killing his enemies, he saved them. On a quiet morning in 1944, an American B-29 bomber limped over the Pacific after a raid over Japan. Its engines were failing, its crew bleeding, and death seemed certain. Below them, a Japanese Zero fighter rose through the clouds, its machine guns ready. The bomber crew braced for impact. But then, nothing happened. Instead of attacking, the Zero circled them, wings steady, almost protective. The Japanese pilot gestured toward the sea, guiding them toward safety. The Americans couldn't believe what they were seeing. An enemy pilot, showing mercy in the middle of one of the most brutal wars in human history. This is not a story of victory or defeat. It's a story of humanity, buried in the smoke of war. A forgotten act of compassion that crossed enemy lines, transcending the hatred of nations. This is the Japanese pilot who saved an American crew. The story no one told you. By 1944, the Pacific War had transformed into a vast battlefield, stretching across endless skies and oceans. What began as Japan's dream of dominance had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The Japanese Empire, once triumphant at Pearl Harbor and across Southeast Asia, now faced relentless American counterattacks. Island after island fell under U.S. control, from Tarawa to Saipan, and with each loss, Japan's defense perimeter tightened. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was now struggling to protect its homeland. It was a time when the sun never seemed to rise over Japan's skies without the distant echo of bombers. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had become Japan's symbol of aerial power and sacrifice. Sleek, agile, and feared in the early years of the war, it ruled the skies. But by 1944, it was meeting its match. American aircraft like the Hellcat and the Mustang were faster, tougher, and deadlier. Yet, despite being outmatched, Japanese pilots continued to fight with unmatched devotion. They were trained under a single creed. That dying for the emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. Each mission was not just a battle. It was a ritual of loyalty. For many of these young men, war was not about politics or conquest. They were farm boys, fishermen's sons, and students who had been taught from childhood that sacrifice was sacred. Inside their cockpits, they carried good luck charms, letters from mothers, or small family photos tucked near their instruments, silent reminders of the lives they were ready to give up. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service told them their deaths would inspire the nation, and many believed it. But among them were a few who began to question what true honor meant. One of these men was Saburo Sakai, a name that would later echo through the history of Japanese aviation. Sakai was not just another pilot. He was an ace, a master of the skies. With over 60 confirmed kills, he had survived gunshot wounds to the head, crash landings, and impossible missions. But what truly defined him was not his victories. It was his sense of humanity. In one of his most famous encounters, Sakai approached an unarmed American reconnaissance plane over the Solomon Islands. His orders were clear: destroy the enemy. But when he flew close enough to see the young, terrified gunner staring back at him, something inside him shifted. He saw not an enemy, but another human being, a man just like him, flying because his country demanded it. Instead of firing, Sakai dipped his wings in respect and turned away, allowing the American crew to return home. It was an act that defied everything the military had drilled into him. But for Sakai, it was simple. They were soldiers too, he later said. They had families waiting for them, just like I did. This was the essence of his quiet rebellion, a spark of compassion in a sky filled with fire. That same spirit of mercy, rare and dangerous in wartime Japan, would reappear again in 1944, when another Japanese pilot, driven by a similar sense of honor, would make a choice that went against every order, every lesson, and every expectation. A choice that would save a crew of American airmen from certain death. It was the kind of act no one would ever expect from the enemy, and yet, it became one of the most extraordinary moments of humanity to emerge from the Pacific War. The morning sun hung low over the Pacific horizon as a crippled American B-29 Superfortress fought to stay airborne. Its aluminum body was torn apart by flak and fire from its bombing run over Tokyo. Inside, the cabin reeked of smoke, fuel, and blood. The engines coughed and sputtered, 2 of them already dead, while the propellers on the remaining ones struggled to keep the massive bomber aloft. The crew, 9 young men from across the United States, had seen the heart of hell that day. Anti-aircraft shells had exploded all around them, shaking the plane like a rag doll. Now, as they limped south over open water, survival seemed like an impossible dream. Lieutenant Raymond Hall, the pilot, wiped sweat and soot from his face as he tried to steady the controls. The once proud bomber, Dynamite, was dying. The right wing was riddled with holes. The radio was shot, and the oxygen system was gone. Down below, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, shimmering in deceptive calm. A grave waiting to swallow them. The navigator's voice cracked through the intercom. "We've lost formation, sir. No contact with base. We're alone." In the back, Sergeant Lewis, the tail gunner, clutched a blood-soaked bandage around his thigh. The smell of burning metal and oil filled the fuselage. Every man aboard knew they couldn't make it back to Saipan. The only question was whether they'd die in the air or in the sea. Some prayed quietly. Others simply stared at the floor, numb with exhaustion and fear. And then, as if fate decided they hadn't suffered enough, the co-pilot shouted, "Zero! We've got a buggy at 6 o'clock high!" Every heartbeat froze. Through the smoke-streaked windows they saw it. A Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighter climbing toward them from below, its white fuselage glinting like a blade in the morning sun. The Zero, the most feared symbol of Japanese air power, was designed for one purpose: to destroy. Its pilot was fast, skilled, and utterly devoted to his mission. Inside the B-29, panic surged. "Guns ready!" Hall barked. Though deep down he knew the truth. Their rear turret was jammed, and their ammo belts were nearly empty. The bomber crew had no real defense. If the Zero opened fire, they'd be torn apart in seconds. The wounded tail gunner whispered a prayer, his trembling hand resting on the trigger that no longer worked. The Zero drew closer, its nose pointed straight at the crippled bomber. The crew braced for the final attack. Some shouted last words, some stared into the sky, waiting for the flash of cannon fire. But instead of bullets, silence filled the air. The Japanese fighter leveled off beside them, no more than 50 yards away. The American crew could see the pilot clearly now, a young man in a white flight scarf and goggles, his face calm, unreadable. He didn't reach for his guns. He didn't attack. He simply flew beside them, keeping perfect pace with their dying plane. The crew exchanged stunned looks. "What the hell is he doing?" The co-pilot muttered. The pilot in the Zero raised his gloved hand and gestured, first pointing at the bomber, then to the south, then making a flat motion with his palm, as if guiding them downward. He was showing them a direction. toward open sea, away from the coast of Japan. Lieutenant Hall stared, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. The enemy was helping them. The man trained to kill them was now their guardian. For long, tense minutes, the two aircraft flew side by side through the smoky Pacific sky, an unspoken truce between mortal enemies. And then, the Zero pilot did something no one expected. He gave a small salute, a gesture of respect between warriors, before banking away and vanishing into the clouds. The crew of the Dynamite watched in disbelief as the fighter disappeared, leaving behind nothing but silence and the sound of their dying engines. They didn't know his name. They didn't know why he spared them. But in that moment, thousands of feet above the endless sea, they understood something that no battlefield could teach. That even in the heart of war, humanity could still find a way to break through the smoke. For nearly 10 minutes, the skies above the Pacific held one of the most extraordinary sights of World War II. A wounded American bomber and a Japanese Zero flying side by side in perfect, uneasy silence. The B-29, Dynamite, groaned with every gust of wind, its engines wheezing like dying lungs. Inside, the crew could hear the rhythmic hum of the Zero's propeller beside them. A sound that should have meant death, yet somehow brought an unexpected calm. It was as if two enemies had found themselves suspended between life and death, united by the simple will to survive. Lieutenant Raymond Hall could hardly believe what he was seeing. Through the cracked glass of his cockpit, he could make out the Japanese pilot's face. The young man's expression wasn't one of hatred or bloodlust. It was focused, almost serene. He flew with precision, keeping his fighter perfectly aligned with the bomber, as though he had taken on the role of an escort rather than a hunter. The crew watched him in silence, their hearts pounding, unsure if this was some kind of cruel trick. The Zero's pilot tilted his wings slightly, gesturing again with his hand. His movements were calm, deliberate, pointing southward, then toward the open sea. It was a silent message: go this way. Don't head back over Japan. He seemed to be guiding them away from danger, away from the anti-aircraft zones and the coastal defense lines that would have obliterated them in seconds. Inside the bomber, disbelief gave way to awe. Sergeant Lewis, his uniform soaked with blood, whispered hoarsely, "He's showing us the way." The co-pilot, still trembling, muttered, "He's saving us." No one dared to speak louder than a whisper, afraid that breaking the fragile silence might somehow end the miracle. For a few eternal minutes, the bomber and the fighter cut through the clouds together. Two machines from opposing worlds, moving in rhythm above the endless blue. The air outside was eerily calm, the Pacific stretching out below like a mirror. Even the wounded men, delirious with pain, seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the Japanese pilot began to slow. He flew closer one last time, his plane so near that the American crew could see the kanji characters painted along his fuselage and the faint glint of sunlight on his goggles. And then, in one final act of grace, he raised his right hand in a crisp, respectful salute. The gesture struck the crew harder than any weapon ever could. It was simple, human, and deeply profound, the kind of moment that transcended language, uniforms, and sides. Lieutenant Hall, stunned, returned the salute instinctively. Two enemies, sharing one final wordless exchange, in the middle of a war built on hatred. The Zero held steady for a moment longer, before banking gracefully to the left, its silver wings flashing in the morning sun. The fighter disappeared into a cloud bank, swallowed by mist, leaving the Dynamite alone once again. But now, the silence in the bomber was different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was reverence. For the next 20 minutes, Hall and his crew followed the direction the pilot had indicated. Their fuel was nearly gone, but luck, or fate, guided them to a patch of open sea where they managed to ditch the bomber. The landing was rough, tearing off parts of the fuselage, but every surviving crew member managed to escape into life rafts before the aircraft sank beneath the waves. Hours later, a U.S. Navy patrol boat spotted them and pulled them to safety. When the exhausted men finally reached base, their story spread quickly among airmen. No one could quite believe it. An enemy pilot showing mercy during one of the most ruthless stages of the war. Yet each man aboard swore it was true. In their official debriefing, Lieutenant Hall described it simply. "He could have killed us. He didn't. He saved our lives." The Japanese pilot's identity was never confirmed. Some historians believe he may have been a veteran like Saburo Sakai. Others think he was an anonymous young aviator, guided by his conscience in a fleeting moment of clarity. But whoever he was, that act of compassion became a haunting legend. A story whispered in barracks and remembered long after the guns fell silent. Because in that single act, that one silent gesture, he proved something extraordinary, that even in the darkest heart of World War II, humanity could still survive in the soul of a soldier. The story of that Japanese pilot's mercy cannot be understood without knowing the world he came from. A world ruled by Bushido, the ancient code of the samurai. Long before the Zero fighter ever took to the skies, Japan's warriors had lived and died by this code. It preached loyalty, courage, and honor above all else. To die in service was to die with dignity. To show fear or weakness was a disgrace. By the time of World War II, this philosophy had been reshaped by military leaders into something absolute, a national religion of sacrifice. Every Japanese soldier, sailor, and pilot was expected to embody this spirit, to surrender their humanity in the name of the emperor. From their earliest days in flight training, young aviators were told that compassion for the enemy was a sign of weakness. They were taught that Americans were monsters, invaders who sought to destroy Japan's sacred land and culture. The Imperial Navy drilled into them the idea that death in combat was not loss, but triumph. Before every mission, pilots bowed to the flag, accepted their final orders, and wrote farewell letters to their families. Many carried white headbands with the red rising sun, hakimaki, symbols of courage, purity, and readiness to die. And yet, in the hearts of a few, the old Bushido remained. Not the twisted version molded by war propaganda, but the original spirit of the samurai, to fight with honor, not cruelty. To be ruthless in battle, but not without conscience. For some pilots, like Saburo Sakai, that ancient code still whispered through the roar of their engines. It reminded them that victory without humanity was hollow. Sakai, Japan's most respected fighter ace, once said that even in war, there was a line that separated men from murderers. After surviving countless dogfights, he refused to shoot down unarmed or wounded enemies. When asked why, he answered with disarming simplicity. They were soldiers, just like me. They had mothers waiting for them, just like I did. It was this moral code, not one written in manuals or orders, but one born of instinct and empathy, that guided pilots like him, and perhaps the unknown aviator who spared the dynamite. To defy orders in wartime Japan was unthinkable. Pilots who failed to engage the enemy risked being branded cowards, or worse, traitors. Yet, in that fleeting moment in the sky, the Zero pilot chose mercy over duty. Maybe he saw the wounded Americans struggling to survive and recognized something familiar: fear, exhaustion, humanity. Maybe he remembered his own comrades who never made it home, and realized that killing these men would only add to the endless chain of suffering. Whatever his reason, it was a decision that went against every command, but stayed true to the deeper meaning of honor. After the war, many Japanese veterans spoke of this inner conflict, the war between the soul and the sword. They were trained to be warriors, but born as men, with hearts that still felt. The pilot's act of compassion was not weakness. It was the purest expression of Bushido, one that even his superiors could never erase. When Saburo Sakai was interviewed decades after the war, he reflected on how his understanding of Bushido had changed. "Honor is not in how many you kill," he said quietly, "but in how you live, and how you treat those you could have destroyed." Those words, though spoken years later, seem to echo through time, perfectly describing that silent moment of mercy in 1944. Because in that brief encounter above the Pacific, the Japanese pilot proved something that no war manual ever could. That true honor is not bound by uniforms or nations. It exists in the courage to choose humanity when everything around you demands hate. And in that moment, the samurai spirit didn't vanish into history. It soared. The story of the Japanese pilot who spared the lives of an American bomber crew has largely been lost to the noise of history, buried under statistics, victory tallies, and the endless retelling of battles and losses. Yet, for the men who survived that encounter, it was the moment that defined their understanding of war and humanity. When they returned to their base, exhausted, wounded, and shaken, their account was met with disbelief. Some officers dismissed it as confusion or shock. Others refused to record it, unwilling to admit that mercy could exist in an enemy they had been taught to despise. Official reports noted only that the crew of Dynamite had been rescued after ditching in the Pacific. The nameless Japanese pilot who made it possible disappeared into obscurity, unmentioned, unacknowledged, yet unforgettable. In the years that followed, the surviving crewmen often spoke of that day in quiet tones, not with grand gestures or medals, but with deep reverence. Lieutenant Raymond Hall, in letters written decades later, called it a lesson from heaven. He said that the man who could have killed them had instead shown us what humanity truly meant, even when the world had gone insane. These men, who had seen death up close, never forgot the eyes behind that zero cockpit, calm, steady, and merciful. They could not name him, but they carried his memory like a sacred secret. As time moved on and the war ended, the two nations that once sought each other's destruction began to rebuild and reconnect. In 1945, the atomic bombs fell, and Japan surrendered. The world shifted, but among the ashes and rebuilding, stories like this became bridges of understanding. When former enemies met in peace years later, American veterans visiting Japan, Japanese pilots speaking in interviews, they discovered they were not so different after all. Both had fought for duty, for survival, and for the men beside them, and both carried scars that no victory parade could erase. The nameless pilot's act of mercy became a quiet legend among airmen who heard it. A whispered tale that traveled through reunions, veteran meetings, and aviation circles. Some said he was an experienced pilot, maybe even one of Japan's remaining aces. Others believed he was just a young man whose heart had not yet been hardened by war. Whoever he was, his action broke through the walls of propaganda and hatred that both sides had built. In a world that demanded vengeance, he chose compassion. Historians still debate whether the man was inspired by the old Bushido code or by something even simpler, empathy. Perhaps it was the sight of the burning bomber, the wounded men inside, or the knowledge that they, too, were sons of mothers who prayed for their safe return. That realization, in a split second, may have overridden everything else. Duty, orders, even survival. In a broader sense, this moment reflects what so many forget about WWII. It is not fought by monsters, but by men, human beings capable of both cruelty and grace. The pilot's choice did not end the war, but it challenged its spirit. It was proof that even at the height of destruction, humanity could still exist between enemies. As decades passed and veterans from both nations grew old, this story became a symbol of reconciliation, a testament that compassion has the power to outlive hate. When American and Japanese veterans finally shook hands at peace ceremonies in later years, they often spoke of moments like this, moments when one man's mercy changed everything. No monument bears that Japanese pilot's name. No medal was ever pinned to his chest. But perhaps his legacy doesn't need one. His memorial lives on in the hearts of those he saved, and in the lesson his choice left behind, that even amid the fire and fury of World War II, humanity was never truly lost, because sometimes the greatest victory a soldier can achieve is not in how many enemies he defeats, but in the single act of mercy that reminds the world what it means to be human.